Stop believing that Kodak was a victim of bad luck, because the truth is they were the architects of their own destruction. Imagine holding the future of human history in your hand, realizing it holds the power to make your existing business obsolete, and then choosing to bury it in a concrete bunker for 20 years. That is exactly what Kodak did. While we often hear the narrative that digital cameras killed Kodak, the reality is far more sinister and tactical. It wasn't a failure of technology, it was a failure of corporate morality and an addiction to a business model that was essentially a legalized drug trade. To understand the collapse of this behemoth, you have to look past the patent filings and into the boardroom, where executives traded the company's survival for short-term stock buybacks. By the time they realized the world had moved on, the legacy of George Eastman, the man who once made photography a democratic right, had been turned into a hollow shell of corporate greed. At its peak, Kodak was not just a company, it was a monolith. It employed over 140,000 people. It had margins that would make a modern software company blush. Why? Because Kodak pioneered the razor and blade model in the physical world. They sold cameras at a loss, or at break-even prices, to ensure that every household on the planet would be forced to buy their proprietary film, their chemicals, and their high-margin developing paper for the rest of their lives. It was an ecosystem of dependency. Every birthday, every graduation, every wedding was a transaction that flowed directly into Kodak's coffers. They didn't just sell products, they sold the memories of humanity. And this monopoly was so powerful that for much of the 20th century, Kodak was synonymous with photography itself. But this addiction to the film cycle created a toxic corporate culture that viewed innovation as a threat rather than an opportunity. In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson sat in a lab and created something that would eventually rewrite the laws of human communication. He built the world's first digital camera. It was the size of a toaster, recorded at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels, and took 23 seconds to save an image to a cassette tape. When Sasson showed his invention to the upper management at Kodak, their reaction was not excitement or curiosity. It was pure, unadulterated fear. One executive famously told him, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." Why would they fear the digital revolution? Because digital cameras didn't require film. No film meant no development. No development meant no profit margin on the back end. Kodak wasn't protecting their technology, they were protecting a rent-seeking business model that had served them for a century. They essentially had a time machine in their basement, and they chose to leave it locked. Consider the strategic paralysis that gripped Rochester, New York, during the 1990s. While competitors like Sony and Canon were pouring billions into CCD sensors and digital hardware, Kodak spent its massive cash reserves on acquiring chemical companies and pharmaceutical firms that had absolutely nothing to do with their core competency. They were suffering from a terminal case of core competency myopia. They believed that since they dominated the chemical world of silver halide, they would inevitably dominate the world of pixels. But pixels are not chemicals. Software is not a physical commodity. By the time Kodak launched its EasyShare digital camera line in the early 2000s, they were already a decade behind in the software race. They were trying to fight a digital war with an analog strategy, and the market punished them with surgical precision. But the rot went deeper than just bad product management. It was a failure of leadership. The board of directors at Kodak was filled with men who had spent their entire lives climbing the corporate ladder of the film industry. They didn't understand the internet. They didn't understand user experience. They didn't understand that photography was transitioning from a private, saved memory business to a social, shared communication business. They watched companies like Facebook and Instagram emerge, and they didn't see the disruption of photography, they saw a threat to their print business. They tried to force people to print digital photos at home using their expensive ink cartridges, a desperate, dying grasp at the old model that alienated every single digital consumer. Think about the sheer scale of the fall. In 1997, Kodak's market capitalization sat at roughly $31 billion. By 2012, they were forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. During that 15-year span, they literally burned through tens of billions of dollars in innovation R&D that yielded almost nothing of value because the corporate culture was designed to kill any project that threatened the film department. They had a department called Digital Product Group that was consistently gutted by executives who wanted to preserve film dividends for the next quarterly report. It was the ultimate example of institutional suicide. They didn't run out of money, they ran out of imagination. They were trapped by their own success, blinded by the very profits that had once made them the most profitable company on the Fortune 500 list. Let's analyze the mechanics of the collapse through the lens of the innovator's dilemma. Clayton Christensen famously coined this term to describe companies that listen to their best customers and improve their products, only to be disrupted by inferior, cheaper alternatives that eventually get better. Kodak's customers loved film. They wanted better film. They wanted more vibrant colors. So, Kodak listened. They invested billions in making the best film on Earth, ignoring the fact that the inferior digital camera was doubling in power every 18 months, following Moore's law, while film technology had hit a physical ceiling. Kodak was fighting a war against physics and economics, and they were trying to win it with loyalty programs and legacy marketing. They had the patents, the infrastructure, and the talent, but they lacked the one thing that separates titans from ghosts, the courage to destroy their own business before someone else did. Even in their final days, the arrogance persisted. When they finally turned to digital, they tried to pivot into an advertising agency model and then, bizarrely, into blockchain and cryptocurrency schemes in a last-ditch effort to pump their failing stock price. It was a chaotic, disorganized, and desperate exit from the stage of history. A company that once defined the American century had devolved into a cautionary tale told in business schools across the globe. They failed to realize that their job wasn't to sell film, their job was to facilitate the human need to capture and share moments. By conflating the medium with the mission, they paved their own road to insolvency. This is not just a story about a camera company. It is a terrifying reality of what happens when a company becomes too big to change. Every single industry today, from automotive to artificial intelligence, is sitting on its own version of digital photography. There are companies right now, holding technologies that could destroy their current business models, and they are choosing to bury them, just like Kodak did. They are choosing short-term stock price appreciation over long-term survival. The question is not why Kodak failed, but who is next. What massive, monolithic corporation is currently ignoring the digital camera of their industry, waiting for the inevitable moment when the market decides their time is up? If you think about the shift from film to digital, it's not just a technical change, it's a cultural shift in how we perceive reality. Kodak controlled that perception for 100 years. When they lost control, they lost their identity. They didn't just lose money, they lost their soul in a sea of accounting errors and failed pivots. When the bankruptcy documents were filed in 2012, it wasn't the death of Kodak, it was the final acceptance that the world they had built had ceased to exist. They were a company stuck in 1975, trying to operate in 2012, and the resulting friction burned the entire empire to the ground. Looking back, we see that the true tragedy of Kodak wasn't their ignorance. They knew exactly what was happening. They saw the trends. They saw the data. They had the labs and the engineers who predicted the death of film with startling accuracy. The tragedy was the systemic inability to act on that knowledge. It was a failure of the human spirit within the corporate structure. It was the triumph of comfort over courage. So, what can we learn from this $31 billion mistake? We learn that survival is not guaranteed by your past performance. We learn that your greatest asset can easily become your greatest liability. And most importantly, we learn that if you don't build your own replacement, someone else will. If this brutal analysis of Kodak's demise shocked you, you need to watch our next video on the secret, violent collapse of the company that once owned the global communications network. The story of how they turned a literal planetary monopoly into dust is even more insane than this. Click the link on the screen right now to see why no company is truly too big to fail.